who was a monster ball player, my son, he was going to get drafted, and he turns to me and goes, Blue Lagoon, right? And I go, yeah, yeah, yeah.
The Blue Lagoon was a paradise on screen, an unforgettable love story the world fell in love with. But behind the cameras was a reality far darker and more disturbing than most fans ever knew. Christopher Atkins and Brooke Shields were pushed into situations that blurred the line between performance and reality. The intensity of it all lingered long after the cameras stopped rolling, and years later, Brooke Shields herself would look back and admit with certainty that a film like The Blue Lagoon could never be made in today's world. Sadly, what unfolded on that island didn't stay there. It followed Christopher Atkins into his personal life, his finances, and his health, shaping a destiny far more turbulent than the film itself. Christopher's rise to fame. Before Hollywood ever knew his name, Christopher Atkins was living a life that could not have been further from red carpets or flashing cameras. The Blue Lagoon would make him famous overnight, but the experiences he carried away from that set would change him in ways he never imagined. Christopher Atkins was born February 21, 1961, into a family that balanced very different worlds. Although his family looked steady from the outside, Christopher grew up moving between divorced parents, learning early what it meant to live in two households at once. In those early years, Hollywood was the last thing on his mind. Acting wasn't part of his world, and his dream was to make it big in baseball. From the moment he first picked up a bat, Christopher pictured himself on a baseball diamond, chasing the life of a professional athlete. But life has a way of redrawing even the clearest plans. As a teenager, Christopher was diagnosed with chondromalacia, a condition that slowly breaks down the cartilage in the knee. For someone whose dreams depended on speed and strength, it was devastating. The pain was real, but the bigger wound was knowing that his body was refusing to carry him where he wanted to go. His future on the baseball field was gone before it had ever truly begun, and with it, the career he had built his hopes around. Losing that dream could have left him wandering without direction, but instead, it pushed him toward paths he never expected. He stepped in front of the camera as a model, his blonde hair and striking blue eyes catching the attention of the fashion world at exactly the right moment. Christopher appeared in 17 magazine, and his face soon became a familiar sight in advertisements for fashion brands. At the same time, he also began building a life outdoors, closer to the water than to the stage. He worked as a sailing instructor, teaching people to handle the wind and the current, and then as a lifeguard, keeping watch over swimmers with the responsibility and athleticism the job demanded. These jobs grounded him, teaching him discipline, patience, and confidence in situations where others depended on him to stay steady. But even Christopher couldn't have predicted what was about to happen to him next. His life was about to change in a way that seemed impossible. And the most shocking part about his rise to fame was the fact that when the opportunity of a lifetime finally appeared, it almost slipped right through his fingers. Christopher Atkins came closer than most people realized to never getting the chance that would define his career forever. He almost didn't get the role. Christopher Atkins' journey into the Blue Lagoon didn't happen the way most Hollywood stories begin, with agents and endless auditions. In fact, it almost didn't happen at all. If not for the casual suggestion of a friend, his life might have followed a completely different course. That friend encouraged him to try out for a new movie being cast, a film that was looking for unknown teenagers who could bring raw authenticity to a story set far from the modern world. Christopher reportedly had no acting background, no training, and no connections to the industry, yet he decided to walk into the audition room anyway. The production was in the hands of director Randall Kleiser, who had already achieved success with Grease. Kleiser and his team were searching among thousands of young hopefuls for the right faces to carry the film. The audition process drew more than 4,000 teenagers, many of them far more experienced than Christopher, yet something about his presence stood out. He was handsome, athletic, and unpolished in a way that matched the story they wanted to tell. Out of thousands, Kleiser chose him. With no experience and no preparation for what it meant to be a movie star, Christopher Atkins had suddenly been handed the lead role in a film that would soon be seen around the world. The production took him halfway across the globe to Turtle Island in Fiji, a lush but remote setting that became both home and workplace for months of filming. To bring the story of survival on a deserted island to life, they had to live closer to the real thing than most actors ever would. Native Fijians taught him practical skills like how to fish, how to build, and how to adapt to the rhythms of the island itself. Those lessons went beyond acting. They shaped the way he approached each day on set. The movie was filmed on a relatively modest budget of $4.5 million. By Hollywood standards, that wasn't much, but the filmmakers were confident that the story and the striking setting would capture audiences. When The Blue Lagoon premiered, the gamble paid off far beyond what anyone could have predicted. The film went on to gross nearly $58.8 million at the box office, making it the 9th highest-grossing film of 1980 in North America. The success was enormous, and for Christopher, it meant overnight fame. What made the experience even more surreal was the reaction from Hollywood. Though critics were harsh on the film, dismissing it with negative reviews and sharp commentary, audiences made it a phenomenon. People filled theaters to watch the story unfold, and Christopher Atkins became the face of a cultural moment. At only 19 years old, he was nominated for a Golden Globe in the category of New Star of the Year, Male, cementing his sudden rise in the industry. That one role opened the door to more opportunities. In 1982, he starred in The Pirate Movie, a musical comedy that played on the swashbuckling adventures of classic pirate tales. The following year, he appeared in A Night in Heaven, adding to his growing resume of early 1980s films. His career then expanded into television, where he landed a recurring role on Dallas, one of the most popular shows of its time. In only a few short years, he had gone from teaching sailing lessons in New York to living in tents on a Fijian island, starring in box office hits, singing on the radio, and appearing on one of television's biggest series. The speed and scale of the transformation were almost impossible to process. All of it had begun with a single audition he nearly ignored, one suggestion from a friend that altered the course of his life. But while The Blue Lagoon and the fame that followed looked like a dream come true from the outside, the reality of making that movie was far more complicated. Behind the scenes, the production was full of challenges that would test Christopher in ways he never expected and would leave marks on him long after the cameras stopped rolling. The show faced many challenges. When audiences first saw The Blue Lagoon in theaters, what they experienced on screen was an exotic fantasy, a story of two castaway children growing up in paradise. The tropical setting looked untouched by time, the water shimmered with endless blue, and the young stars appeared effortless in their roles. Yet behind those images lay a reality that was far more complicated. The production faced enormous challenges, the kind that tested not only the crew, but also Christopher Atkins and Brooke Shields, who were still in their teens, and completely unprepared for the storm of difficulties that came with the making of this film. The first hurdle was the location itself. Turtle Island in Fiji may have looked idyllic, but it was not designed to host a large Hollywood production. There was no real infrastructure, no convenient accommodations, and no safety net when problems arose. Cast and crew members were housed in tents pitched along the island, which meant they lived with the same heat, humidity, and discomfort that the characters were meant to endure on screen. Food supplies had to be managed carefully, medical attention was limited, and the remoteness of the island made even the simplest task feel like a logistical challenge. Living in that environment soon gave rise to physical problems that went beyond mere inconvenience. The island was crawling with rats, and infestations were a constant nuisance. Crew members fell ill with pneumonia, while others developed injuries that came from working day after day in heat and damp conditions without the relief of proper care. Even Brooke Shields, who was still only 14 at the time, found herself overwhelmed during one particularly demanding scene. While filming a sequence that required her to portray the pain of childbirth, she was struck with a real coughing fit. The crew thought it was a stroke of acting genius, unaware that she was in genuine distress. That single moment revealed how easily the line blurred between performance and reality on a set where survival sometimes felt as pressing as storytelling. For Christopher Atkins, The physical demands extended in ways most people never see when watching a film. Because the story required their characters to appear untouched by civilization, the actors had to spend hours in the sun to maintain a consistent tan that suggested years of island living. This task was uncomfortable and exhausting, especially for teenagers suddenly confronted with the pressures of modesty. Brooke Shields faced an additional burden that highlighted how carefully the production balanced between creating the illusion the film required and trying to preserve a sense of protection. Her hair was physically taped to her body during certain scenes to ensure protection, a process that was not only restrictive but also painful over long days of shooting. These adjustments might have seemed small in the grand scheme of things, yet for the young actors living through them, they were daily reminders of how unnatural and demanding the work really was. Beyond the physical strain, the atmosphere on set carried a more subtle but equally intense form of pressure. The producers were convinced that the story of The Blue Lagoon would resonate more deeply if the chemistry between its two leads extended beyond the script. To achieve this, they encouraged Christopher and Brooke to develop feelings for each other off-camera, believing that an actual romance would heighten the authenticity of their performances. Christopher was suddenly thrust into a surreal new world, and this suggestion added a confusing layer to an already overwhelming situation. But for Brooke, the pressure was even more intrusive. She resisted the attempts to manipulate her emotions, recognizing that the push for a real relationship was neither fair nor comfortable. Already dealing with the awkwardness of portraying sensitive scenes, she now had to fend off subtle but persistent attempts to shape her feelings for the sake of art. At some point, the production felt as much an endurance test as a film shoot. Every scene that appeared effortless on screen was layered with the reality of discomfort, tension, and vulnerability. And yet, against the odds, the movie was finished. What the world later saw was a polished version of paradise, untouched and serene, while those who had lived through the production remembered the exhaustion, the pain, and the pressure. But these challenges did not disappear when the cameras stopped rolling. In fact, they raised questions about how far filmmakers were willing to go for authenticity, and how much weight was placed on the shoulders of two young actors asked to carry an entire production. And as the world celebrated the film's beauty, another conversation centered on the ethical concerns of the production was already beginning to emerge. The ethical concerns. As the success of The Blue Lagoon spread across the world, audiences marveled at its lush setting, its tale of innocence turned into love, and the striking beauty of its two young leads. Yet behind the admiration lay a conversation that has only grown louder with time. This conversation has questioned not only the choices of the filmmakers, but also the very foundation of what it meant to put teenagers into such a story. These ethical concerns surrounding the production have become an inseparable part of its legacy, raising questions that could not be ignored then and would be impossible to excuse today. The most pressing concern was the actors' ages. When the cameras rolled on Turtle Island, Christopher Atkins was 18 years old, legally an adult but still inexperienced in life and in acting. Brooke Shields, however, was only 14. She was a child, asked to portray vulnerable moments for the world to see. To protect her, a body double was used for certain scenes. However, Christopher had no such opportunity. He was required to perform those moments himself, fully aware of the scrutiny that would follow. The use of a body double and the careful management of camera angles created the impression the producers wanted without exposing Brooke directly. But the effect on audiences was the same. People debated endlessly about the propriety of casting someone so young in such a role. The controversy became part of the film's identity, with critics and parents alike asking why a story like that had been carried by actors who were, in real life, still adolescents themselves. Adding to the debate was the decision of Brooke's mother, Terry Shields, to approve the role for her daughter. Terry, who managed Brooke's career, insisted that the production take steps to protect her, pointing out that her daughter was protected and that nothing inappropriate was actually shown. Yet many questioned whether a parent could truly consent on behalf of a teenager. The approval may have satisfied the studio and kept the film moving forward, but for much of the public, it only deepened the discomfort. Despite efforts to protect her, Controversy followed Brooke Shields for years because of the Blue Lagoon. For many, the question was not whether the filmmakers followed the letter of the law, but whether they had crossed a moral boundary in the pursuit of art. Shields herself has said openly that such a film would never be allowed today, and in many ways, her words serve as an indictment of the system that permitted it then. Christopher, too, has admitted that filming those moments was awkward and felt overwhelming. Both young actors carried the weight of scenes that demanded more of them than they should ever have been asked to give. But these ethical questions extended beyond the treatment of the actors. The film also drew criticism for its handling of animals during production. Reports have surfaced that real fish were used during the filming of certain scenes, a detail that today would immediately ignite outrage. At the time, those concerns were less widely discussed, but they added another layer to the uneasy legacy of a movie that seemed to cross lines in multiple directions. The film was marketed as a romantic adventure, a story about love and survival in a paradise untouched by civilization. Yet for those involved, it carried shadows that were harder to ignore. Christopher Atkins gained fame but admitted to feeling uncomfortable and unprepared. Brooke Shields became a household name but carried the burden of controversy that followed her into adulthood. The movie made millions and became a pop culture phenomenon, but its legacy has always been entwined with the ethical questions that surrounded it from the very start. And while the audience at the time could only guess at what really went on during filming, there were truths about the making of the Blue Lagoon that few people ever heard, truths that reveal an even deeper and more complicated story behind the paradise the cameras captured. The truth they didn't tell you. For all its fame, The Blue Lagoon is a film surrounded by details that many viewers either overlooked at the time or never fully understood. Beneath the romantic images of two young castaways discovering love on a deserted island were truths the production did not highlight, elements of the story and the filmmaking that gave the movie a layer of complexity most audiences were not prepared to confront. One of the most striking truths lies in the relationship between the two main characters. Richard and Emmeline, the boy and girl stranded together after a shipwreck, are not strangers brought together by circumstance but cousins. The novel that inspired the film made this clear, and the adaptation retained it. They are first cousins, a fact that introduces a quiet but undeniable sense of taboo into the story. To many, the romance was simply a tale of innocent love and isolation. But for those who noticed the family connection, the relationship carried a layer of discomfort. Hollywood never promoted the film with this detail front and center, yet it sits at the heart of the story, reminding us that the paradise on screen was never as simple as it looked. Another overlooked detail is the use of the fictional Arita berries, sometimes remembered as never-wake-up berries, which appear in the climax of the film. These berries become a symbol of both innocence and mortality, representing the characters' childlike understanding of life and death in a world without guidance. When Richard, Emmeline, and their child consume them, the story reaches its most dramatic moment, one that many viewers interpreted as an ending in death. The symbolism was heavy, drawing from old myths and moral tales, and it gave the film an edge of tragedy that lingered long after the credits rolled. Yet the ending was not as final as many thought. The last scene, in which the family drifts unconscious in a small boat, has long been debated. Some audiences walked away believing that the characters had died, their lives ended by the poisonous berries. But the dialogue within the film hints that they might not be dead, only asleep, leaving their fate deliberately ambiguous. It was a choice that divided audiences, with some embracing the open-ended nature of the finale and others frustrated by the lack of closure. This ambiguity became part of the film's mystique, ensuring that viewers would continue to discuss its meaning for decades. The truth about the filming location also added another layer of intrigue. While the movie created the image of an untouched paradise known as the Blue Lagoon, the setting itself was not a single magical place, but a real island in Fiji called Nanuya Levu. The island, now famous largely because of the film, bore little resemblance to the mythical lagoon of the story. Instead, the production transformed it into the vision audiences saw, constructing sets and carefully framing shots to create the illusion of an Eden-like world. Today, fans still visit Nanuya Levu expecting to find the very lagoon they saw in theaters, only to discover that much of it existed only in the imagination of the filmmakers. The film even went on to spawn a sequel more than a decade later. Return to the Blue Lagoon, released in 1991, starred a young Mila Jovovich, who would later rise to international fame, and Brian Krause. Neither Christopher Atkins nor Brooke Shields returned for the follow-up, and the sequel failed to capture the same cultural moment as the original. Yet its existence proved how deeply the first film had imprinted itself on popular culture. This cultural impact extended far beyond the theater. The Blue Lagoon inspired parodies in television and film, from sitcom jokes to sketch comedy routines, where the image of two young castaways became shorthand for innocence, awkward romance, or even scandal. It stirred debates about censorship, about how much could be shown on screen, and about how far filmmakers could go in portraying sensitive subjects. For some, the film was a beautiful coming-of-age tale set against a backdrop of paradise. But for others, it was a troubling reminder of Hollywood's willingness to blur moral boundaries for the sake of spectacle. And while audiences around the world debated what they had seen, the experience was far more personal for Christopher Atkins himself. For him, the movie was not simply a cultural phenomenon. It was the project that would forever define his public identity, a role that changed his life in ways he could never have imagined when he first walked into that audition room. The Blue Lagoon changed his life. When Christopher Atkins returned from Fiji and the world finally saw The Blue Lagoon, nothing in his life would ever be the same again. The film catapulted him into instant recognition, but fame is rarely a straight road. And for Christopher, the years that followed were filled with both extraordinary highs and devastating lows. The story of how that one role changed his life is as dramatic as anything the cameras captured on Turtle Island. In the early years after the film's release, Christopher found himself stepping into the spotlight not only as an actor, but also as a figure of fascination. His good looks and sudden fame meant that his romantic life drew attention almost immediately. He dated actress Cynthia Gibb, who at the time was also rising in the entertainment world. Their relationship was short-lived, but it showed the way Hollywood paired its young stars together in a constant cycle of publicity and curiosity. Eventually, he found a connection that would last longer and change his personal life in profound ways. While filming for the Playboy channel, Christopher met Lynn Barron, an Australian model whose presence matched his own in charm and glamour. The two fell in love, and in 1985 they tied the knot. Together, they had 2 children, building a family even as Christopher navigated the pressures of fame and a career that was far less stable than it appeared from the outside. For more than 2 decades, the marriage endured, until 2007 when they divorced, closing one of the longest chapters in his personal story. But long before that divorce, other storms had already shaken Christopher's world. In the mid-1980s, while his fame from the Blue Lagoon and his later roles still lingered, his financial stability began to collapse. He had entrusted his career earnings to his manager, Mick Schneider, only to discover later that Schneider had embezzled vast sums of money from multiple clients. Christopher lost nearly $500,000, an enormous sum that left him teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. It was a cruel twist. An actor who had once starred in one of the highest-grossing films of its time now found himself wondering how to pay his bills, betrayed by someone he had trusted with his future. The financial disaster fed into an even deeper crisis. And by 1986, Christopher's struggles had reached a breaking point. Alcohol became the way he tried to escape the pressure, the disappointment, and the sense of loss that came with seeing his career slip out of his control. The downward spiral eventually led to a breakdown that forced him to confront the truth of his situation. That year, he entered rehab, beginning a battle for sobriety that would define his life as much as his acting career ever had. Recovery was neither quick nor easy, but Christopher committed himself fully to it. Over time, he not only rebuilt his health, but also embraced a path of long-term sobriety. For more than 2 decades, he has maintained that commitment, regularly attending Alcoholics Anonymous meetings and speaking openly about the struggles that nearly consumed him. He finally found steadiness in sobriety, creating a foundation that allowed him to move forward with purpose. Part of that new direction involved reinventing himself outside of Hollywood. While he continued to take on roles, he also turned toward business, building a career as an entrepreneur. He became a luxury pool builder, creating high-end designs that reflected both creativity and precision. He also developed the Strike Jacket Extreme fishing lure, tapping into his lifelong love of the outdoors and transforming it into an innovative product. In these ventures, Christopher proved that his identity was not tied solely to his past as an actor, but could expand into new and unexpected directions. Yet, Hollywood never fully left him. Christopher returned to the screen in later years, often in roles that celebrated the era he came from. In 2023, he appeared in Ladies of the 80s, A Diva's Christmas, a nostalgic project that reunited stars from the decade that had defined his own early fame. The film even brought him back together with Linda Gray, his former co-star from Dallas, creating a moment of full-circle reflection for both actors and audiences who remembered them from decades before. The impact of the Blue Lagoon on Christopher Atkins' life is undeniable. The movie gave him fame, opportunity, and a place in pop culture history. But it also exposed him to pressures that nearly destroyed him, from financial betrayal to addiction. Yet through marriage, loss, recovery, and reinvention, Christopher carved out a life that went far beyond the tropical island that first made him famous. Today, he stands as a reminder that fame may come suddenly, but survival requires endurance, honesty, and the willingness to begin again. Do you think the producers of The Blue Lagoon did enough to protect young Atkins and Shields? Drop your answers in the comment section below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click on the next video on your screen like this video and subscribe to our channel for more updates.